Good evening. Rosemary Church with news from Australia Television. Tonight, still no resolution in sight for the political crisis in Pakistan, and Australia in the running to sell rice to Japan. But first, the Nobel Peace Prize has been awarded jointly to South African President F.W. de Klerk and ANC leader Nelson Mandela. The two men received the award for their roles in peacefully eradicating apartheid in South Africa. The Nobel Committee says both men have shown personal integrity and great political courage in laying the foundations for a new democratic South Africa. In 1990, Mr de Klerk lifted the ban on the ANC and freed Mr Mandela after the black anti-apartheid leader had spent 28 years in jail. Mr Mandela is the second ANC leader to win the award. He's widely expected to win South Africa's first non-racial election next April and succeed Mr de Klerk as president. As Pakistan's national parliament prepares to elect a new prime minister, there's still no apparent resolution to the country's political crisis. As Australia Television's Gordon Taylor reports from Pakistan, both major parties are still trying to woo the independents and minor parties in a bid to secure government.
Ever since last week's inconclusive election result, the two main parties have been vying for the support of 47 independents and fringe party politicians. Allegations abound of vote buying, with Pakistani press reports putting the price of each of the uncommitted legislators at up to 20 million rupees, or about $1 million. In an effort to stop parliamentarians continually switching their support and demanding ever higher prices, the interim government has passed a law banning floor crossing by individuals elected on a party ticket. The law does not, however, apply to independents.
Australia now appears to be a front-runner in the contest to sell rice to Japan. Severe crop damage has forced the Japanese government to reconsider its ban on imported rice, and reports suggest the Japanese cabinet is looking favourably on Australia. Japan says it's a one-off, but Australian rice growers hope it may be the start of a steady export trade.
Severe storm damage to its rice crop has forced Japan to take the rare step of allowing emergency imports to meet demand. The shortfall could exceed 1 million tonnes, and last month Japanese officials announced a list of potential suppliers for the first 200,000 tonnes. Today, the Japanese news agency Kyodo indicated Australia could help supply the balance. The report says Japan's agriculture minister had suggested to his cabinet colleagues that Australia be asked to provide rice for Japan. Australian rice industry officials say they're yet to confirm reports of the cabinet discussion, but would naturally welcome any such development. It's believed with increased production, Australia could supply up to 300,000 tonnes of rice to meet the Japanese shortfall. And growers here would be hoping that would pave the way for continued exports.
I think a lot depends on what happens in the GATT round of trade negotiations. If we can get a successful conclusion to the agriculture component of GATT, then Japan's going to find it very difficult not to permanently lift some of its restrictions.
But the Japanese government is continuing to stress its rice market is only open in the short term to offset its worst harvest in 50 years.
The chief of the Indonesian Armed Forces has acknowledged that his troops were in the wrong in a shooting incident on the island of Madura last month, which left 4 people dead. From Jakarta, Michael Ma reports General Faisal Tanjung has promised to punish all those responsible for the shooting.
General Faisal has been quoted in Indonesian media reports as saying that security forces were unprofessional in their handling of the land rights demonstration on the island of Madura, which lies off the east coast of Java. 3 of the protesters were killed after troops fired on them. Another died later of wounds in hospital. Initially, the military claimed that its men had fired in self-defence after being threatened by a mob wielding knives and machetes. But the armed forces chief is now reported to have conceded it was the security forces who were at fault. General Faisal has promised to punish those responsible for the shootings, but the military has ruled out holding an independent inquiry into the incident.
Cambodian Joint Prime Minister Hun Sen has warned peace talks with the Khmer Rouge may be cancelled if the faction refuses to recognise the country's new government. The Khmer Rouge has so far failed to officially accept the new administration, a key condition for the talks.
The warning has put the Khmer Rouge on notice that it must meet key political conditions if there's to be a stable peace in Cambodia. The guerrilla faction has attacked government settlements in the north of the country in what observers say is an attempt to secure leverage ahead of the proposed peace talks. But Hun Sen says the Khmer Rouge's intransigence has put the talks in doubt. The faction has offered to hand over territory under its control and its 10,000-strong guerrilla force. But it's still refusing to recognise the new administration in Phnom Penh. Hun Sen says unless the faction meets this key demand, its hopes of an advisory role to the government may be dashed. There's uproar in Thailand over plans to allow the private sector to commercially develop the country's national parks. Senior government politicians say the plans won't diminish conservation controls, but opponents say the proposal defeats the purpose of having national parks.
I can say that the Forest Department will not accept the plan. It is against the principle of national park management that places emphasis on conservation rather than exploitation.
Thailand's last government ordered upmarket facilities at a major national park destroyed after noise and pollution drove away the park's animals. Opponents of the latest proposal say it'll bring about more uncontrolled construction, which will destroy park ecosystems. Buddhist monks have reconsecrated one of their most famous statues at a special 3-day ceremony in Beijing. Carved from a single 26-metre-high sandalwood tree, the statue of Maitreya has just undergone extensive renovations. At the heart of this week's ceremony, rituals to ensure the soul of the Buddha can re-enter the statue, uncontaminated by human hands.
Chinese authorities say they've stopped demonstrations and outlawed illegal organisations in Xining, the capital of the far northwest Qinghai province. Australia Television's Ali Moore reports from Beijing that it's a rare Chinese acknowledgement of unrest in the area, which has a large Muslim population.
China's official Xinhua news service says a handful of people recently formed illegal organisations, occupied mosques by force and disrupted the social order in Xining, under the pretext of protesting against a Taiwanese published book. In August, there were unofficial reports of widespread demonstrations against the book, which includes a drawing of a pig next to a praying Muslim. The Xinhua report says a small minority of Muslims made use of the issue to undermine national unity, assaulting local party and government officers, smashing police vehicles and attacking armed policemen.
Amnesty International has published a report alleging widespread human rights abuses in North Korea. The document claims thousands of people have been detained or tortured since the 1960s, as Australia Television's Mark Bowling reports.
North Korea remains one of the world's most isolated countries. It's taken the international human rights organisation Amnesty decades to independently obtain information about the country, which is strictly regulated and doesn't tolerate political dissent. The report says the victims of arbitrary detentions, executions and torture include foreign nationals, Koreans returning from abroad, intellectuals, students and officials. Amnesty has submitted its report to North Korea and received a brief reply denying the claims.
Philippine President Fidel Ramos has blamed rapid population growth for the country's enormous ecological problems. In a speech marking World Food Day, the president said population growth has to be reined in. From Manila, Australia Television's Deirdre Martin reports.
President Fidel Ramos says the country's fast-growing population is a heavy burden, which is draining natural resources and straining the environment's ability to renew itself. He says there's a vicious cycle at work when poverty compels people to destroy their environment, and this destruction pushes people further into poverty. The president says the Philippines has less than 10% of its forests left, and every year loses 1 billion cubic metres of topsoil to erosion. 70% of coral reefs and a third of mango forests have been destroyed, while half of the major rivers are heavily polluted.
The American pilot, released by Somali faction leader General Aidid, is on his way to Germany to be reunited with his wife. The injured pilot was evacuated to Mogadishu airport by a US helicopter. General Aidid is using the release to demand a role in the country's peace process.
Captive US pilot Michael Durant was the first to be released, emerging after his 11-day ordeal looking ill and strained. He'd suffered multiple injuries, including a broken leg. The Nigerian UN soldier followed, overjoyed at his release after 5 weeks' captivity.
I'm very happy to do as they do.
A little earlier, General Aidid himself emerged from the shadows for the first time in 4 months to play his ace, the soldiers' unconditional return. But he appealed to the United Nations to release those of his supporters who'd been detained. He expressed disquiet about the build-up by US troops, but said everything could be worked out.
There's no reason to exclude me for the peace process and for the future rebuilding of Somali people.
Even though General Aidid said he released the captives unconditionally, he's doubtless hoping his gesture of reconciliation will clear the air with the Americans and allow him to re-enter the political process.
We showed that we were determined to protect our soldiers and to react when appropriate by strengthening our position there. I think the policy was plainly right, but there was no deal.
Earlier, Aidid's supporters rallied in the capital in support of peace. It was left to the head of UN operations, Admiral Jonathan Howe, to welcome the gesture from the man he had branded as an outlaw.
We are focusing our efforts on peaceful reconciliation of the mandate.
Howe also said the UN policy of disarming Somalia's factions would continue. But for the moment, a ceasefire appears to be in place, and military sources say American troops have been given orders to stand down.
2 white extremists have been sentenced to death for murdering South African Communist Party leader Chris Hani. But black South Africans are angry over the acquittal of a 3rd suspect, Australian-born Gail Derby-Lewis. From Johannesburg, Australia Television's Marius Benson reports.
To the people of South Africa's black townships, Chris Hani was a hero. Among black leaders, he ranked behind only Nelson Mandela. His murder 6 months ago was a political assassination, and the conviction of his killers a political event. His widow Dimpo came to hear the verdict in the company of her daughter, her husband's political allies, and her bodyguards. Inside the courthouse was the man who took Chris Hani's life, Janusz Walusz, a Polish immigrant motivated by a fierce hatred of communism. He was convicted of murder. Also convicted of murder was the man who armed Walusz, Clive Derby-Lewis, a leading figure in the whites-only Conservative Party. He once told a rally of the extremist AWB movement that his mission in life was to ensure the survival of whites in the new South Africa. For his role in the killing, he was found guilty of murder and the illegal possession of a firearm. His Australian-born wife, Gay Derby-Lewis, was accused of compiling a hit list of assassination targets, which was found in Walusz's possession. The judge called her a liar, but ruled that the case against her had not been proved. She went free.
The verdict that 2 of the 3 accused were guilty was widely anticipated towards the end of the case, but it didn't satisfy the large black crowd gathered outside the court behind heavy security when the verdict was brought down.
The crowd outside the court took up the controversial chant of "Kill the Boer, kill the farmer," as Dimpo Hani warned that the acquittal of Gay Derby-Lewis had left a viper free to plot again.
We need our democracy, but we have to do it in a peaceful manner. Amanda!
The murder of Chris Hani 6 months ago sparked fears of an even bloodier wave of violence across South Africa. Now the concern is that the verdict on his killers might itself provide the impetus for more killings.
In Haiti, the pro-democracy justice minister has been assassinated. The killing came just hours after President Clinton warned Haiti's military leaders to restore democracy or face US reprisal. Witnesses say armed civilians opened fire on Guy Maleri's car, killing him and 3 of his staff. They were gunned down outside the same Port-au-Prince church where another prominent supporter of exiled President Jean-Bertrand Aristide was shot dead last month. The murders are the latest in a series of violent incidents as the military digs in against last July's UN-brokered agreement to return Aristide to power.
Those people don't want this country to be a democratic country. They want to prevent the change.
The UN has decided to reimpose sanctions against Haiti from Monday to try to bring the military into line. Russian President Boris Yeltsin has banned 15 newspapers, including Pravda. The papers were all under temporary suspension for inciting violence after backing Yeltsin's opponents. But now the president has made it permanent, and critics say there's no way the elections in December can be free and fair.
Human rights activists have already been complaining that President Yeltsin's state of emergency is undemocratic, unjust, and maybe even unlawful. But now Mr. Yeltsin's gone further, with a permanent ban on 15 opposition newspapers. Tonight, staff left the offices of Pravda, one of the most famous papers in the world, after being told it will cease to exist unless they change its name and its editor. Pravda was founded by Lenin more than 80 years ago, and it became the official voice of the Soviet Communist Party, read by millions. Now its managers say if it is suppressed, there can be no genuine democracy in Russia.
It's very clear that without the opposition, without the alternative views expressed and present, you can't speak about democracy.
Only last year, a law was passed protecting the freedom of the press in Russia. Tonight's crackdown by the government clearly violates that law, but Mr. Yeltsin's press minister is unrepentant. These are not just opposition papers, says Vladimir Shumenko. They're papers that printed direct appeals for the violent overthrow of our government. But tonight, there are concerns not only about freedom of the press in Russia, but also about freedom of the individual, with widespread claims that the current state of emergency is racist and being used to round up non-Russian ethnic minorities in Moscow. It's expected the state of emergency will be lifted within the next few days. But even so, Mr. Yeltsin's draconian measures against his political opponents tonight can only renew doubts about whether the elections he's called for December really can be free and fair.
In Australia, a Sydney court has been told 9 men conspired to defraud the company Elders IXL of more than $66 million. One of the men named as a conspirator is former Elders boss and prominent businessman John Elliott.
It's been an extraordinary week, headed by John Elliott's attack on the National Crime Authority. Mr. Elliott and 4 other former Elders executives, including the head of Victoria's TAB, gained injunctions effectively protecting them from investigation or charges until later this month. But today, the Treasurer of the Bank of New Zealand in Australia was arrested at his Darling Point home. 35-year-old Michael Woods faced Central Court charged with conspiring with John Dorman Elliott, Peter Damien Scanlon, Kenneth Charles Jarrett, Kenneth Robert Biggins, Peter Robert Cam, Alan Robert Hawkins, Victor George Saltis, Brian David Fitzgerald and Paul Anthony Richards to defraud Elders IXL Limited. It's alleged $39.5 million was dishonestly disguised as payment in January 1988, and that another $27 million was passed on by Elders to the Bank of New Zealand, disguised as a settlement for a genuine foreign exchange transaction in September 1988. Michael Wood's barrister complained of an extraordinary delay between the initial investigation and bringing the charge.
I am innocent, I've done nothing wrong, and I will prove it in court. That's all I have to say.
Later, his former banking colleague, Victor Saltis, also appeared in court facing the same charges, which his lawyers say he'll also contest. Despite allegations that the deals were done in Victoria, calls for both men to be extradited there have been put on hold. Mr. Woods and Mr. Saltis were granted bail of $100,000 each. They've been ordered to surrender their passports and will appear in Sydney's Downing Court next month.
The federal government's modified wine tax proposals have been rejected by the West Australian Greens, again jeopardising the federal budget. The Greens say they'll vote against the revised package, but some wine producers say the industry is being held to ransom.
After weeks of lobbying, the government's revised wine tax package, announced just 2 days ago, at last had John Dawkins smiling.
The industry and the government are now at peace with each other.
But today, the Greens took the smile off his face, saying that for the sake of some smaller growers, they'd block the package in the Senate.
We've received requests from both the South Australian Farmers Federation wine growers and the Margaret River Association to not support the package, so that's what we're planning to do.
Under the government's revised package, which the Democrats have supported, the sales tax on wine would be set at 22% as soon as Parliament endorsed the compromise, rising in mid-1994 to 24% and to 26% a year later. But the last two of the proposed increases to 32% would be postponed pending an Industry Commission inquiry into wine's export prospects. There'd also be cash grants to winemakers to offset the taxes.
The package that's been produced addresses the larger growers, and their capacity to cope with it is greater than the smaller players in the wine industry.
Tonight, some larger growers were furious.
Well, we're staggered that a small group in Western Australia now are going to hold, 90% of the wine industry to ransom.
But the Greens say the budget is still not equitable for smaller groups and the lower paid.
And so far, the government has thumbed its nose at those concerns.
The Greens say they hope Mr Dawkins will come up with more modifications before they have to vote next week.
Liberal Senator Bronwyn Bishop is moving to win the prized lower house federal seat being vacated by long-time member Jim Carlton. Senator Bishop spent much of her day denying leadership ambitions, but Liberal leader John Hewson will now be under pressure to find her a job in the shadow cabinet.
Senator Bronwyn Bishop was up early this morning to begin her run for one of Australia's most prized Liberal seats.
It makes an opportunity for me, and I will be a candidate.
Jim Carlton is providing that opportunity by retiring from Parliament at the end of this year to become Chief of the Australian Red Cross, leaving his Mackellar electorate, covering Sydney's northern beaches, up for grabs. Mr Carlton says he's not leaving just to facilitate Senator Bishop's run for the lower house, although he concedes she could well have a head start.
We had a meeting with her recently in one of the branches, very well attended, and she's been invited already to a barbecue arranged some time ago. So she's quite popular amongst many branch members.
In fact, her broad popular appeal has reignited leadership speculation in the Liberal Party, despite Senator Bishop's attempts to extinguish it on her media rounds this morning.
Dr Hewson's the leader. He's doing an excellent job. John Hewson is the leader. He's doing well in the polls. Dr Hewson is the leader. He's doing well.
And at this stage, Dr Hewson is returning the compliments.
She's a great asset to our party. She's very popular. She's got a very, very good reputation in the way that she's handled particular issues.
And Senator Bishop's media blitz is having an impact on possible rivals for the seat. Dr Bob Woods, the former Shadow Health Minister who was defeated in the March election, says he's more likely to seek Senator Bishop's upper house spot than run against her in the pre-selection. While Senator Bishop will continue to play down the leadership issue, her lower house move will certainly put pressure on John Hewson to quickly find a place for her in shadow cabinet. And that means someone will have to go. So the tensions will start building from now.
The revival of an old bush industry is providing new income for drought-stricken farmers in northwest Queensland. The sandalwood tree, which is used to make incense, is increasingly in demand in Asia, with hundreds of tonnes now exported from Queensland every year.
Queensland has been sending sandalwood overseas for almost 70 years, but its export value has only recently been recognised. Countries like India and Indonesia are battling to save their crops after years of exploitation. Now they're turning to Australia for the wood, which is used to make incense and joss sticks. Graziers in northwest Queensland are cashing in on the boom.
I think in the past sandalwood has been destroyed along with clearing programs in the process of getting pastures established, but I think given its rise in value, people will start to realise that sandalwood really is a valuable resource to have on the property.
About 600 tonnes is shipped to Taiwan each year after initial processing locally. Although Western Australia provides competition, growers here say the Queensland version is just as good.
It's one of the better qualities of oil content in sandalwood here in Queensland is in this area. Some of the better sandalwood comes off of the basalt wall, which is not far from here.
The Department of Primary Industries has begun a research program to ensure it remains sustainable, providing another source of valuable income in the bush.
One of Australia's more unique primary products is on the move. The first and perhaps the only shipment of ostriches from Canada has been snapped up by breeders in a drive to supply lucrative export markets.
In the last 5 years, the number of ostrich farmers has jumped from 40 to almost 300. At current levels of production, Australia could process 100,000 birds a year to meet world demand for meat, leather and feathers. Australia has only 10,000 birds, and producers are eager to develop the national breeding stock. Ostrich meat is low in fat and cholesterol, and recent slaughters in Queensland have involved a secret technique that should give Australia a marketing edge when exports begin.
We can get the pH level right, that it can have a shelf life of up to 15 weeks, chilled.
Quality will be as vital as quantity. 120 birds recently arrived from Canada at a cost of $5 million. Their parents came from Botswana, thoroughbreds among these flightless feather dusters. After 2 months quarantine at Cocos Island, they've been distributed around the country for breeding. One of the major benefits of the import from Canada is an improvement in the bloodlines for Australian birds. Until now, all ostriches here came from the same gene pool, brought from South Africa in the late 1800s.
They're a much bigger bird, and of course the feather quality on the Canadian bird is a lot brilliant. It's a brilliant feather, and of course we've got a bird that's going to produce as bigger chicks.
Laying almost 100 fertile eggs a year, the Canadian ostriches should have an immediate impact on the Australian industry, with chicks expected to sell for $6,000 each.
And now for a look at finance. Share prices gained ground on the Tokyo Stock Exchange, the Nikkei average finishing the week nearly 92 points stronger. Hong Kong share prices shot up 4.18% in a buying frenzy following comments by Governor Chris Patten designed to break the deadlock in Sino-British talks. Singapore's SES index climbed nearly 11 points to close at 553.18. On the Australian market, late profit-taking saw the All Ordinaries close 12 points up. Australia's currency firmed to 66.27 US cents. Gold prices in Hong Kong closed the week unchanged, while in Australia, bullion rose again to $367.5 US an ounce. Turning to sport now, and in cycling, 75 riders have started a 1,200-kilometre race from northern New South Wales to Canberra. Dutch rider Servaes Kanavan is leading after the first day's racing, followed by Australians Henk Vogels and David McKenzie.
It's probably the first time any riders in this year's Classic have competed on a golf buggy track. Picturesque, but with not much room to manoeuvre, and made that more testing today with wet conditions, which forced a reduction in the length of course from over 8 kilometres to just 3.5.
It's going to be the man with the most guts, so to speak. The one that's the craziest is the one that's going to win this race.
While many riders opted for a conservative start, Dutch rider Servaes Kanavan took the opposite approach, attacking the course with a winning time of 5 minutes and 9 seconds. A remarkable 19 seconds clear of English rider Rob Harris, with the winner of last year's time trial, Australian Olympian Henk Vogels, just 0.07 of a second further back in third spot. Riders take to the road tomorrow for a 164-kilometre stage to Port Macquarie, followed by a 30-kilometre criterium.
Now for a look at tomorrow's headlines. The Jakarta Post reports Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin has met Indonesia's President Suharto during a brief surprise visit to Jakarta. Republica says support for Information Minister Harmoko is growing as the ruling Golkar group prepares for the election of a new chairman. And in Australia, the Canberra Times says Boris Yeltsin's meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Hosokawa has paved the way for a settlement of the Kurile Islands dispute. Now to the weather. Thunderstorms across most of the region, with Singapore and Manila heading for a top of 30 degrees. Bangkok 35, Kuala Lumpur 32. Fine and 27 in Jakarta, 28 and cloudy for Macau. In Australia, showers on the Cocos and Christmas Islands with temperatures in the high 20s. Rain and 21 in Sydney, also rain for Brisbane. Showers for Canberra and Adelaide, fine in the remaining capitals. Recapping tonight's main stories, Nelson Mandela and South African President F.W. de Klerk joint winners of the Nobel Peace Prize for their work in peacefully eradicating apartheid. Australian rice farmers hopeful of big sales to Japan as crop damage forces Tokyo to ease its long-time ban on rice imports. And in Haiti, gunmen assassinate the country's pro-democracy justice minister as the UN prepares to reimpose sanctions. And that's the news from Australia Television for the moment. For our satellite viewers, I'll be back shortly with our weekly news magazine. But for now, good night.